the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and pay my respects to all Indigenous people participating in the webinar today, or who might listen to this webinar recording after the event. I acknowledge that First Nations people have cared for and nurtured these beautiful lands for centuries, and that sovereignty was never ceded over this land, and that it was and always will be Aboriginal land. You're very warmly welcomed today for the 8th webinar in a series of webinars to develop greater knowledge and understanding of the Convention on the Rights of the Child here in Australia. Today's specific focus builds on the last webinar, which can be accessed on our YouTube channel, and it's on the timely topic of climate change and the rights of children. This webinar series has been organised by the Diplomacy Training Programme in partnership with Youth Law Australia and Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. Climate change is referred to as the greatest threat facing children and young people today. UNICEF's Children's Climate Risk Index, which was published last week, reveals that 1 billion children are at extremely high risk of the impacts of climate change, and that's nearly half of all children. Australia, according to those figures, is ranked as 16th out of the top 20 countries that are ranked on CO2 emissions, and that's percentage of global countries. And responding to the government's report on the implementation of the convention in Australia, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has emphasised, and this is a quote, that the effects of climate change have an undeniable impact on children's rights. And they noted their extreme concern about, and this is a quote, the state parties' insufficient progress on climate goals and targets that they committed to in the Paris Climate Agreement. So clearly we need action before it's too late. The UN Committee are taking action. They have launched the development of the new General Comment on Climate Change. Our esteemed speakers today will provide unique perspectives on the work that's being done at the level of the UN and at the grassroots levels to bring about change. So I'd like to first of all introduce our speakers and then hand over to my co-chair, Dr. Plague. Dr. Otani is the chair of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and an international human rights lawyer based in Tokyo. Her work focuses on human rights education, early childhood development, children's participation, children involved in human trafficking and child marriage, migrant children, and their access to justice. She is currently a council member of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, a commissioner of the International Commission of Jurists, and country representative of Japan for the Family Law and Family Rights section of LAWASIA. And our second speaker today is Keelab Pollard, who is the president of the Pisfcc, which is a youth-led regional organisation with a mandate to advocate for rights-based solutions, to educate and activate young people to take action against climate injustices. He is a very busy person. He's a final year student as well at the University of the South Pacific, majoring in geography and economics. And he's really working very hard to promote quality education to young people to become better stewards and decision makers of their community, environment, and their resources. So I'd like to pass over now to my colleague, Dr. Noam Plague, a senior lecturer at UNSW, who spoke at our last webinar on climate change and children's rights, drawing his own work in that space. He's going to explain a few housekeeping rules. He's going to introduce each speaker in turn, and then he's going to chair the question and answer session. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Plague.
Thank you, Faith, and good afternoon, everyone. I would also like to start my part of the conversation with acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where my house in Sydney stands upon, and to extend my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today, past, present, and emerging. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this webinar, as Faith was mentioned. And I'm mostly pleasure to give you some housekeeping rules before we get to business. So if you can, please mute your microphones and turn on your camera so you can see who is in the room. And currently we have 81 participants in these meetings. Please be mindful of the fact that this webinar is recorded and is live streamed. So it will be available to everyone afterward at the DTP YouTube channel, the same way as all our previous webinars are available for you to watch. Our speakers will speak each between 10 to 15 minutes, so we should have a healthy 25 minutes session of Q&A. If you have any questions, please pop them on the chat box. We pick up questions from there. And you also have opportunities to ask more questions during the Q&A session, also in open mic, if you would like. During the two talks, we'll post some links with information of cases and reports for your references. And at the end of the conversation, at the end of the webinar or later today, Claire Sidoti from the DTP will send all of you the relevant links as well, including with some details about our next and future webinars. So without further ado, let's hand over to Dr. Mikiko Otani, the chairperson of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, who will take us through the coming general comment on children's rights and the environment. Dr. Otani, please.
Thank you, Faith, and thank you, Noam, and a very good afternoon to all of you. The Committee on the Rights of the Child in May this year decided to embark the process of drafting a new general comment on children's rights and the environment with a special focus on climate change. Drafting a general comment was one of the recommendations to the committee already in the report of the 2016 Day of General Discussion on Children's Rights and the Environment. Since then, we have continued to hear the call for that from civil societies and children. The voice of children asking for the recognition of climate change as a child rights crisis and the immediate actions has become bigger and bigger. Against this backdrop, it was inevitable for the committee to decide to undertake the responsibility to produce a new general comment on this issue. Our decision has received positive responses from the many people and organizations. At the beginning of the drafting process of this very important general comment for all children over the world, today and future, I'm very grateful to be given this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on the new general comment, which I call GC26 in my presentation today. I think it is useful for us to reflect what we expect for this new general comment. Australian government stated in its submission on the draft GC25 that, I quote, Australia does not regard general comments as legally binding on state parties, end of quote. Such an attitude of the state parties is not unusual. The International Human Rights Law and Practice Committee of the International Law Association, in its final report published in 2004 on the impact of the findings of the UN Human Rights Treaty bodies, noted that government tend to stress that findings of the treaty bodies, including general comments, are not in themselves formally binding interpretation of the treaty. The report refers to the comment on the Norwegian government that the general comments of the treaty bodies, and I quote again, are not legally binding, but are of great significance when interpreting the conventions, end of quote. The report of the International Law Association suggests that general comments may be viewed as a legitimate source for interpreting the treaty as subsequent practice in the application of the treaty, which establishes the agreement of the parties regarding its interpretation, to be taken into account in the interpretation of the treaty according to Article 31, Paragraph 3 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. The report in supporting this argument pays attention to the fact that the general comments are circulated to all state parties following their adoptions, and some state parties have occasionally expressed their disagreement with general comments adopted by the Human Rights Committee, which is one of the UN treaty bodies like CRC. In light of this, the report further suggests that the acquiescence of state parties to the general comments and national court decisions accepting the interpretation pronounced by the treaty body in the general comments would be relevant to the question of the agreement of the parties. The study by the International Law Association provides us with some interesting points for consideration on how to strengthen the argument that the new general comments should be considered as a legitimate source for interpreting the CRC in the framework of the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties. Of course, a new general comment 26 after its adoption should be referred in the reporting procedures and individual communications procedures by the committee to reinforce its normative value as its own jurisprudence. The GC26 should be also vigorously used in the legal arguments in the national courts and in the advocacy work vis-a-vis the governments, so that more state practice are generated and developed in forms of the government responses and decisions of the national courts. Such practices should be collected from as many state parties in the world as possible and analyzed. All these efforts should be made after the adoption of the GC26 by the committee, lawyers, academia, and civil society organizations in their respective capacities, but it will take time. So now that we are still before the actual work of the drafting process of the GC26, we can and should discuss its contents and drafting process to strengthen its normative value for its future use. This is the argument I'd like to make today. Concerning the contents, as Australian government noted, and as we are also aware of, general comments often contain both pronouncements of legal obligations of the state parties and recommendations to the state parties as guidance on legislative, policy, and other measures to implement the obligations under the convention. In this regard, Australian government recommended to the committee distinguishing more clearly in the GC between the legal obligation of state parties under the convention and the committee's recommendations as implementation steps, which are not obligatory in their view. Such response from state parties is suggestive of the practical approach we should consider to take. That is a need on our part to be clear what legal propositions we want to pronounce as the obligations of the state parties in the GC26 and formulate and present them as legally convincing interpretation of the convention. For this purpose, it is very important for the committee to receive inputs and contributions from experts, including civil societies and practitioners as future users of the GC26 for their advocacy work and legal arguments in the courts, as well as those who have expertise on the particular issues to be dealt with in the GC26. The drafting process is also very relevant in relation to the normative value of the general comment. Wide consultation process open to the public and dedicated to children in particular is essential to reflect views of interested stakeholders and those of children. Furthermore, giving the opportunity to the state parties to submit their positions and comments on the draft GC to the committee before its adoption may be argued to justify the enhancement of its normative value. It will be more meaningful, in particular, if state parties don't express disagreement with the interpretation of the convention pronounced in the draft GC, or the specific points submitted by the state parties are actually reflected in the adopted GC. From this point of view, the current practice of the committee to invite state parties to comment on the draft GC before its adoption in accordance to the General Assembly Resolution 68/268 in 2014 may contribute to the argument to recognize a stronger normative value of the general comments. In this regard, I'd like to emphasize the importance that the pronouncements of the legal obligation of the state parties are carefully crafted and clearly presented in the draft GC 26 to draw attention of the state parties. CEDAW Committee's informal briefing to the state parties on the draft General Recommendation 38 on trafficking in women and girls in the context of global migration before its adoption held last year is a good practice. Civil society organizations can also play a role to encourage the state parties to provide comments on the draft GC 26. In the remaining minutes given to me, I'd like to discuss what are most critical issues to be clarified and articulated in the GC 26 in the limit of 10,700 words established by the General Assembly Resolution 68/268. Many important pronouncements have already been made on children's rights and the environment and climate change in the documents of the UN human rights mechanisms, such as the report of the 2016 DGD of the CRC, the report of the Special Rapporteur on the Environment, on Children's Rights and Environment in 2018, the joint statement of 5 UN human rights treaty bodies, including the CRC on human rights and climate change in 2019, and very recently, the Human Rights Council resolution on realizing the right of the child through a healthy environment in 2020. Having those already existing documents, are there any missing issues that GC 26 should focus and elaborate? Are there points that need more legal clarity or stronger legal basis or reasoning? Would it be worse and have added values if the GC 2016 reiterates the same points that were already made earlier in other documents of the UN human rights bodies? These questions would guide us in choosing the issues for the contents of the GC 26 in the word limit. I'd like to mention some points and issues which, in my view, would deserve special attention for the GC 26. First, as a general approach, the propositions of the legal obligations of the state parties need to be presented with a basis of or as the interpretation of specific articles of the convention. Second, extraterritorial and collective nature of the issue of environment and climate change and its implication on the legal obligations of the state parties to cooperate with other states and provide effective access to remedies for children should be explored. Third, how the GC 2016 can be made a useful document for children to demand the actions of the business enterprises and hold them accountable is another point for considerations, as the general comment is a document in principle addressed to state parties. The last point I'd like to highlight before ending my presentation is urgency. Time matters. It is a challenge for the committee whether, and how the drafting process of the GC26 can be accelerated while ensuring wide and meaningful consultative process for the state parties, experts, children, and all interested stakeholders. At the same time, all available mechanisms, platforms, and procedures at the national, regional, and international levels should be used to develop norms, policies, and practices to protect children's rights related to the environment and climate change in parallel to drafting process of the GC26. There is no reason for us to wait for the adoption of the GC26 to respond to this crisis of children's rights. Also, the outcomes of the ongoing efforts and activities can be fed into and help reinforce the quality, normative value, and practical significance of the GC26. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Otani, thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation and for giving us a lot of fruitful thought as to how can we engage with this process and what the committee is expecting us as academics, as civil society actors, and as children to do. We might pick up on some of those points that you've raised at the Q&A session. So now let's move to the user side of this general comment. And invite Caleb Bora, the president of the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, which is a youth-led organization who advocate for rights-based solution for climate change, for his presentation. Caleb, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Noam, for that introduction. So good evening from the Solomon Islands. I would first like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to share on this ongoing story. It's a pleasure to learn more on children's rights. Thank you to Dr. Otani for your comprehensive presentation. I wholeheartedly agree that in these critical times, all available mechanisms should be used to protect children's rights. So I was reading the recent UNICEF report, The Climate Crisis is a Child Rights Crisis, the other day. And what really caught my attention was that almost half of the world's children live in one of the 33 countries classified as extremely high risk of climate impacts. Some 240 million children around the world are highly exposed to coastal flooding, and 400 million are vulnerable to cyclones. It's also worth noting is that the Children's Climate Risk Index, a composite index that brings a number of variables together to measure risk across 163 countries with a focus on children exposure to climate and environmental shocks and stresses and child vulnerability. Upon close inspection, the CCRI findings show that those in developing countries are more vulnerable and at high risk in comparison to the developed nations. The CCR findings reinforce what the Pacific and global climate movements have been calling out for long: climate injustice. Those contributing less to the problem are the ones experiencing the worst of the consequences. This line may be a cliche statement but it still captures the harsh reality, especially for us in the Pacific. To put this into the perspective, here are some examples. Health. Children in the Pacific need strong and resilient health systems for children to survive and thrive, but this is not the case. Areas with weak infrastructure will experience greater strains on the health systems due to the impact of climate change. For instance, children below 5 are most vulnerable to vector-borne diseases such as malaria or dengue. Now, with increased precipitation and abnormal rainfall, it is creating a suitable temperature and climate conditions for mosquitoes to multiply. Education. Children's lack of access to a quality education reduces their resilience and adaptive capacity, further increasing their vulnerabilities to climate and environmental hazards. For instance, with cyclones and flooding, schools are forced to close down for a certain amount of time. Sharing my personal experience while visiting a coastal rural community in the Solomon Islands, when it rains, children do not attend school since their means of transport is to paddle to school, which places them at a learning disadvantage. And lastly, the right to life. Tropical cyclones bring heavy rain, flooding, strong winds, and these bring destruction to infrastructure, limitations to services, injuries, and death, and in some cases, displacement of people. Just last year, Fiji experienced 3 tropical cyclones, The recent IPCC report shows that it is highly likely that as ocean temperatures warm, there will be an increasing number of high-intensity cyclones, such as Category 4 and Category 5 tropical cyclones. And this creates fear for the children to live in because more severe cyclones will mean more costly in terms of deaths and damage, especially in coastal areas. In 2020, we have seen the record-breaking Category 5 cyclones Harold and Yasa last year. Nevertheless, although the adverse effects of climate change are disproportionately felt throughout the world, the escalating climate crisis affects all children everywhere in often significant life-changing ways throughout their lives. Climate change will continue to undermine the effective enjoyment of the rights enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In this light of this reality, global responses to the climate crisis are not enough, and the political and economical impasse in the climate regime have curbed progress. On this understanding, a group of students from a university of the South Pacific decided to act. After thorough research, the students came across the 2011 Palau Initiative for an UN General Assembly resolution seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change. The International Court of Justice is the principal judicial organ of the UN. Its primary roles are to settle legal disputes submitted to the states and to give advisory opinions on legal questions referred to it by an authorized UN organs and specialized agencies. The advisory opinion jurisdiction of the ICJ has been instrumental in maintaining global peace by clarifying and developing international law. Advisory opinions are by nature not adversarial like contentious cases. They are general legal clarifications and advice that the court provides on specific legal questions. Advisory opinions have been pivotal in the establishment and development of international laws, from the right to self-determination for colonized people, the prevention of genocide, and nuclear disarmament. We believe it could do the same for climate change. The student campaign for an ICJO is not an intention to undermine, but rather complement and bolster global climate negotiations. Central to all advisory opinions is the question that will be put to the court to answer. The question where the student focuses on human rights framing because it highlights the moral high ground we shall all stand on, and it is a forward-looking approach that focuses on the future. A right-centered question would have greater transformative potential given that human rights are inalienable and not based on the lowest common denominator, decision-making demands of consensus-based treaty processes. Although the framing of the actual legal question will have to go through state negotiation, to illustrate what a rights-focused question, we could ask, what are the obligations of states under international law to protect the rights of present and future generations against the adverse effects of climate change? The court, in answering this question, can help bring more clarity towards states' obligations to ensure that the activities and within their control do not cause significant repercussions on the livelihoods of the current and future generations. A positive pronouncement by the court could also help bolster the effectiveness of international legal systems in tackling climate change. For example, by bolstering the authority of human rights bodies, in this case, the Committee of the Rights of the Child, to address climate change under their respective. After concluding drafting of the proposal, along with the students' legal question, we then sent it to the 18 member states of the Pacific Island Forum in 2019. The proposal was then picked up and tabled by the Vanuatu government in the agenda of the Pacific Island Forum leaders. There, the leaders noted the proposal in positive terms, including Pacific's big brothers, Australia and New Zealand. Although New Zealand stated that they are willing to carefully consider the legal question, the Australian government stated that they believe treaty negotiations and human rights councils is the strongest way to address climate change. Not satisfied, we decided to form the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change and launched an ambitious campaign at national, regional, and international level. Throughout our campaigning, we have received widespread support from academics, legal experts, and Pacific civil society organizations supporting the campaign for an ICJO. The campaign also grew beyond the region, where youth from all over the world came together to form the World's Youth for Climate Justice, the network organization for all young campaigners for the ICJO. The global youth momentum is both the realization of the fact that the real chances of addressing climate change will require strengthened multilateralism. For an advisory opinion to be successful, there needs to be a simple majority vote by UN member states in the UN General Assembly, at least 97 states votes in favor. For the Pacific, the most immediate step to achieving this requires Pacific leaders to endorse the proposal for the ICJO in order to initiate the momentum of building a coalition of like-minded states that would help secure a majority at the UNGA. So just to conclude, climate change is taking a toll on the children's education, health, and well-being, and this requires urgent action. As Article 3 of the Conventions of the Child Rights state, the best interests of the child is top priority, but climate change is saying otherwise. Children have a right to have their voices heard on issues that affect them, including on climate change that will affect future generations more than anyone. For us in the Pacific, every inaction is a discount to the human rights of our children and our people. It is only natural that we are willing to consider all international tools available to us to secure the future of the present and future generations, and the Pacific's continued plight against climate change. We continue to look to the additional leadership of Australia and New Zealand. It is time we hear what the world's highest court has to say on climate change. Big falatake Tomas for your kind attention.
Leb, thank you very much for this fantastic and interesting presentation and for telling us about your efforts on the ground and trying to achieve an advisory opinion from the highest court. So from a talk by Dr. Otani that began with some skepticism about the power and usefulness of international law, we end up with a proposition for a general comment on the one hand and an advisory opinion on the other hand from the top relevant bodies. So while we are waiting for your questions and comments to come on the chat, I'll abuse my position as moderator and will kick up with some questions. I'll start with you, Caleb, if you don't mind. So alongside your efforts to secure an advisory opinion from the ICJ, a general comment will come at some point, and we'll ask to hear more about the timeline from Dr. Otani as to when she anticipates the committee to issue this general comment. And as someone who's been engaging in advocacy effort for the last 2 years, I was wondering two questions. A, do you think that the general comment will be useful in your line of work, in your advocacy at all? And if so, what would you like to see this general comment saying?
Yeah, thank you, Noam, for that question. It would be to help with the general comment. I think it would definitely help with the advisory opinion. It would be very useful. I think on the points on what the question could say, it would be definitely on the lines of future generations. I think that will really help with that campaign as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Otani, if I can address two questions. You've mentioned the timeline in your presentation that you hope that the committee will speed up the process comparing to previous drafting processes that the committee has engaged with that could last for 2 or 3 years from issuing the call for inputs to finalizing the general comment and giving the urgency of the situation that both of you have described. I was wondering if you can give us some indication as to what timeline the committee is looking for. And also more specifically, if you have any ideas of the committee has any idea as to the involvement of children in the process of drafting a general comment.
Thank you for the question. Firstly, about the timeline, as I said, that committee just made a decision to start this process in May session. And so now it is a time for the committee to produce a specific work plan for this new general comment. However, the past practices indicate that not so much very far past, but the recent past, the committee has taken 2 years to adopt the general comment from the time of the decision to embark a new general comment. So if we follow the same pattern, it will take 2 years. But this is my personal view. At this moment, I cannot speak on behalf of the committee because now the committee starts working on the work plan. But my personal view is that 2 years is too long. And I always feel that we cannot work in the way as usual business. This is so urgent. Of course, every issue for the children is urgent because the time matters for the children. The meaning of the time is different for the children and for the adults. That's what I have been always feeling as a practicing lawyer dealing with the children's issues. So 2 years from now, and we all know that adoption of the general comment itself is not the same as we see some concrete applications or concrete change in the government policy or law or actions. We start from the adoption of the general comment to start using that general comment in our reporting procedures, individual communications, or in your advocacy work. So my big challenge as a chair now is how I personally, as one of the 18 members, can convince our committee colleagues, members, to think out of box. Do we really need to take 2 years from now? Because as I said in my presentation, we have many already what was done and said. So can we pick up all what I have already said and consolidate and find what is still missing? Or should we say something in a different way to specifically linked to the particular article of the convention? Because this is our mandate to speak about the legal obligation of the states under the convention, in relation to the convention, or from the user's point of view. So what will be the added value for the GC26? So thinking this way, maybe I'm too ambitious, but I think that we can accelerate the process. How far? This is another question. So this is just my personal view, so please don't quote me, but I feel that 1 year would be good enough, or still very long. But if we work very hard and with the support from the experts and civil societies, all the lawyers very specialized in the international environment law and also national environment law and practicing the courts, I think we can do it. And particularly because of this COVID situation. So our work has been so much affected by the COVID-19 because we suspended in-person meeting. But the good things, good lessons learned in the time of COVID is that we can work online. So maybe we can combine the traditional way of work in person, because in-person meeting is it's also very, very important. But can we accelerate using the online work? And in terms of the consultation or participation of children, the committee has adopted the working methods on child participation in reporting procedures, and another working method on child participation in the day of general discussion. We haven't adopted a working method on child participation in the process of drafting general comments. So we don't have written such guideline, but the child participation has been very much essential part of our recent general comments drafting process. So it is a must for us to provide meaningful consultative status for the children. And again, the question is how, and in balancing the urgency and of this drafting process is a question. So what I can say at this moment is that we will start discussing about the detailed work plan in the September session, which will be in-person, face-to-face meeting in Geneva in 2 weeks from now. So this today's webinar is very much timely for me to get your views and support from you. Thank you very much. So please keep your eyes on the announcement, any announcement on the process of this new general comment on the website of the CRC in the coming months, in the coming weeks and months. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was very useful. As a side note, we will obviously share this link and this announcement with everyone who've joined us today. And as a secondary side note, as part of our capacity building program, the larger one with the DTP, we're providing the past support for those of you who would like to submit their reports and their recommendations in the process of drafting general comments. We did it with respect to previous general comments. And if there is any interest, if anyone in the crowd, academics, civil society, or individuals to engage with this process, you can drop us an email and we can see if we can organize a webinar, because face-to-face meetings in Australia are unlikely to happen anytime soon. Maybe a closed-door webinar as to how to draft those submissions to the committee. Always, people are also free to drop me an email, and I'm happy to engage and to help as much as I can. A number of questions are coming through the chat, and also I see that Elvis has put his hand up. Paraphrasing Patrick's question about the PNG report, and we can ask it more broadly to Dr. Otani, how willing the committee will be to see and to review current state parties report and civil society report, shadow reports that will be submitted to you before the publication of general comments that will focus on climate crisis and climate change, and how much will you engage with making a recommendation in this space prior to issuing the general comment on this issue?
Yes, thank you for these questions. So one specific point, perhaps two points in response to these questions. So firstly, as I emphasized in my presentation, that on the one hand, the committee will start working on the drafting of the new general comment, but at the same time, we have another mandated activities, and the reporting process is core to our mandate activities. And we shouldn't miss the opportunity to address this issue in the reporting procedure. So one of the challenges we have is that our current reporting guidelines for the state parties, which tell the state parties what kind of issues the state parties should include in their reports. The environmental issue or climate change are not included in the current reporting guidelines. So that means that state parties don't feel obligated to include this issue in the reporting in the state parties report. You may be aware of the new procedure used by the committee, which is called Simplified reporting procedure. In this case, the committee sets the list of questions to the state parties, and the state parties respond to those set of questions, and the replies from the state parties are considered to be a periodic report. In this case, we can always include the question of the environmental issues or climate change, not to miss the opportunity to intervene in this field. But if the state parties doesn't choose, the state parties have a freedom to opt for this new process. But unless the state parties don't choose this new process, we continue to apply the traditional reporting process. In this case, we first receive the state parties and we send a list of questions. But in this case, list of questions is very much limited only to 10 questions. So it is very challenging for us to always include climate change issues in this just 10 questions. So this is the space. First of all, for the committee, I am already started discussing with my colleagues, can we amend our existing reporting guidelines to include climate change issues so that all the state parties who will start drafting their state reports need to make the reports on this very important issue for all the children and all the countries. This is one, but it will take again time. So we actually rely on the civil society's activism. So I hope to see always the information in the civil society's report to fill the gap which may happen in the state parties report, because we do not systematically ask the state parties to include this information under the traditional reporting process. So that's one thing. And another thing I wanted to say, yes, another challenge I have observed. You may heard in my presentation that currently all the treaty bodies, including CRC, has a challenge of the word limit. Whatever documents we produce as the formal UN document has the word limitations. So, and also the review of the state party report has some challenge of the time limit. We can spend only 6 hours for the dialogue with the state parties, and what we can say as our recommendations in the concluding observations, again, we have that word limit. So one of the call we hear from the civil society is that committee should make the same standardized recommendation to all the state parties, because it will help to reinforce the recommendations. Another voice we hear is that the recommendations should be contextualized or adjusted to the most important issues, because when we say environmental issues or climate change, how the children in that particular country affected may be varied from country to country. So on the one hand, using the recommendations to reinforce a clear voice as a committee. On the other hand, how to specify our recommendations adjusted to the specific context of the children in that country, it's a challenge we are now being faced. So again, your input in the civil society recommendations or the reports would help us to balance these two demanding, for us, very important demanding, one voice, always the same strong recommendation. And on the other hand, how specifically we can address the situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this answer. Before you go to, sorry, to Alice and Becky who raised their hand, Caleb, do you want to jump in and to add something from your perspective about the potential engagement with the committee in the reporting process of various Pacific Islands nations that are due to report in the coming few years, and where you have activists on the ground, and with respect to a general comment?
Yes, thanks, Norm, for that. I do believe there needs to be more participation for those in the Pacific. I think I hope that there will be an opportunity for the Pacific children to meaningfully participate in the general comment, with greater priorities given to the children in rural areas, because these are the ones who are truly at the forefront of this climate crisis. So yeah, that's one comment I can make to that.
Okay, thank you very much. Elvis, do you still have your hand up? You want to pop in?
Yes, I do. Just to say that the first part of my question was asked already, the question that you asked. But the second part that I want to touch base with, and this is to Dr. Otani, level of the committee. This is also on the background of some materials that we have collected. Elvis Fokala, I forgot to say that. I head the Children's Rights Unit at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. What we have found in the continent, and this is at the level of Africa, is that every single state, I mean, all 34 states who are, of course, parties to the CRC, have strategies to mitigate the impact of climate change in the continent. But if we go through these strategies and look at how some of the solutions that they have, we don't really see much that would lead to actually reducing the impact for children as the current situation and in future situations. So my question is, do you think in your September session that you will be able to suggest that the forthcoming general comment should be solution-driven rather than repeating the things that we know and we experience every day already? Thank you. Thanks, Noam.
Dr. Otani would like to take that question.
Yes, thank you very much. This is, I think, the real question and the real challenge. And since the committee decided to embark drafting this new general comment, I have been thinking all the time. And I fully agree with you. The general comment needs to be a useful document to lead to the real change and real tool to protect and the children's rights and mitigate the harm which is already happening to the children on the field. So pronouncements of the legal obligation of the state is one thing, but it is not enough. So how innovative or what kind of general comment we can produce out of box? And I have to be honest that at this moment, I don't have a clear answer. And I really want to hear the new ideas, new way of thinking from all of you, because the author of the general comment is, of course, the committee, but it is for you to choose, for you to use for the children. And so in the chat box, I saw other general comments, such as general comment 16, and I mentioned how the general comment can be used to demand the action of the business, for example. And we have the particular general comment in the past to talk about the state obligations on the impact of business sectors. But how is that document, the general comment, producing the real impact on and is used? So this is one of the questions I have. Another question is the cooperation of the state parties. Because one of the features of this issue is that, as the UNICEF recent report revealed, that the children in most affected countries, those countries has contributed less to the global warming. So because 196 state parties to the CRC bear the responsibilities to protect the children today and future from the global warming. But the state parties may think that it is not only us. What we can do will not change the whole story. So as a CRC, which has a mandate to monitor and encourage all 196 countries to deliver their obligations, how can we make this general comment as a real tool to encourage and actually produce the collective actions which are necessary on the part of the state parties, and how actually the state parties' action can make a real impact on mitigating the harm which is happening in the country which are physically outside of these responsible countries. It is the extraterritorial nature of this obligation of the state parties. So those are all the questions and challenges for me, and I really want to hear from you. And also I want to make another comment on the child participations. So please don't wait for us to say that we are going to do child participation consultation this way and that way. You are the main people who should to get benefit from this upcoming general comment. So you don't need to feel hesitant or the shy to wait for the committees to say something. And I want to share one of the my own practices, my experiences as a coordinator of the committee's working group on DGD 2018 on the theme of protecting and empowering children as human rights defenders. For that DGD 2018, we benefited from the advice of the Global Child Advisory Group, how we can design the DGD 2018. So we learned and we reflected the views of the children in the designing the DGD 2018 itself. So not only about the substantive contribution, but how you can contribute more into the drafting process of this new GC 2016. You can write us or you can share your views with us in whatever channel you have. And I'm very happy to be contacted anytime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Otani, for that. I think also to some extent addresses made a coordinated question that was posted on the chat. We are getting closer to the end of this webinar, and I would like to ask Becky, who raised her hand and waited patiently, to say her comments. Please, Becky.
Hi, I'm Blazy and I am age 11, and I have a comment for the UN. Because lots of children are thought to be uninterested in climate change, but I honestly think that the main thing is that there isn't many chances for children to know about what's going on. For example, I only learned properly about what was going on in grade 3, but I should have had an idea about what was going on in kindergarten. And children are asked how they should design playgrounds and all, and that's great. But I think shouldn't there be more chances for children to know what to comment on climate change and more? And I think this would be more kid-friendly sites to learn about climate change.
As always, Blazy, spot on.
Thank you very much. Very good to hear your voice and ideas. And I fully agree with you that more children of all ages should be interested and think about climate change as their life, as part of their daily life. And school is a good place for the children to learn about climate change. And so that's why the committee is making a recommendation to the state parties to include the education on environmental issues and climate change in the school curriculum. But children don't need to wait until going to the school. The family, community are also a very good opportunity for everyone to understand about the climate change issues. So for the family, the parents are the key actors who can integrate the conversation on climate change and environment issues at the dinner table. So you're smiling, so your mother has been doing, I guess. And in the community everywhere, we can have something to raise awareness about the climate change and the environment. So the whole community, schools, and families should be the places for us to think about the climate change and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And with that, unfortunately, we'll have to finish, so we can go on forever. So please, everyone, join me in thanking our two fantastic speakers, Dr. Mikiko Otani, the chairperson of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and Caleb Pollard, the president of the Pacific Island Students Fighting for Climate Change, for the wonderful presentations and engagement. And let me also say thank you very much for our partners here, Dr. Fred Gordon from the ANU, and obviously for the DTP, who are responsible for making this happen, especially for Claire Sidoti and Andrei Ferkovich, and our partners at Youth Australia, Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, and for this particular webinar, also the Australian Institute for Human Rights. We are continuing our journey, and our next September webinar will be dedicated to using the Convention on the Rights of the Child in judicial processes. So watch out for your inbox for the invitation for this webinar. Recording will be available on YouTube along with all the links that were posted during the last hour. And as I said beforehand, with the DTP, we are always happy to expand our capacity building effort, and anyone who would like to engage in making submissions to the committee with respect to general comments, please get in touch with the DTP or with myself. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a good